So there is an old Hasidic tale, one that I love to tell, which goes as follows. When the great founder of modern Hasidism, the Baal Shem Tov, saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into the forest to meditate. He would light a fire, say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished, the trouble averted. Later, when one of his disciples had the occasion to intercede with the heavens, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, "Master of the universe, I do not know how to light the fire, but I'm still able to say the prayer." And again, the miracle would be accomplished and life would continue with its ups and downs. Later, a disciple of the disciple, in order to save the people once more, would go to the forest and say, "I do not know how to light the fire, and I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be enough." And it was enough, and the miracle of continued life was accomplished. Then it fell to the next generation of disciples to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his house, one of these disciples held his head in his hands and spoke to God, "I am unable to light the fire, and I don't know the prayer, and I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell this story, and it must be enough." And it was. So this story has been on my mind lately in reflecting upon a very different kind of fire that has been ignited, the phenomenon of these encampments erupting across university campuses all over North America, including yesterday at the University of Toronto. We've seen the clips all over social media and we've read all the articles. These tent villages, ostensibly set up to protest the connection of many of these universities with Israel, call for these institutions, as the one at McGill did, to disclose its divestments and to disclose its investments and divest from any that sustain Israeli apartheid, occupation, and illegal settlement in Palestine, to use their quote. On the surface, it might actually seem innocuous, an innocuous intention asking for transparency of information and to make considered decisions if anything appears to be in conflict with the interests of the universities and the values that they espouse. Fine. However, these encampments have devolved into hotbeds of violence and hatred, and reports of clashes are coming from campuses seemingly anywhere and everywhere, from Arizona to California, from New York to Vancouver. Aside from the violence, we can acknowledge also the explicitly anti-Semitic elephant in the room. When you see the banners saying from the river to the sea, or all Zionists are terrorists, or go back to Europe even, when Jewish students and professors are blocked from attending class, prevented from entering their own dorms, an Israeli flag burned, lessons switched to being virtual because they can't guarantee the safety of Jewish students or faculty, when the Times of Israel reports that approximately 25% of the attendees at the Columbia protests weren't actually connected with the university, then we have to question what's going on. And yet, despite all this, I'm left with another question. Why is it so bothersome, apart from the obvious? Ultimately, I came to realize that it was a total lack of intentionality. It's not, to echo the remarks of US President Joe Biden, peaceful protest. To paraphrase Biden, destruction of property, vandalism, disruption to education, threats, intimidation, these things are not peaceful. And moreover, Biden made it clear that it's not doing anything to change his approach or policies concerning the war. Aside from that, in a clip on the Instagram page of Jewish Israeli influencer Chen Mazig, who was with us in Toronto back in November, we can see that many of these students are not fully informed of what they're rebelling against in the first place. The clip shows a student being asked about the goal of the protests taking place at NYU. She says she thinks it was showing our support for Palestine and demanding that NYU stops. I honestly don't know all of what NYU is doing. She then turns to her friend and asks her what NYU is doing about Israel, or in regards to Israel. The friend explicitly says, "I wish I was more educated." The pair then revealed that they were actually from Columbia, up the road, and they came down when they heard somehow that NYU students needed more numbers. Put simply, I'll be blunt in saying that the ignorance was astounding. In the Shalom Hartman Institute's podcast, For Heaven's Sake, Daniel Hartman posits that this is indeed serious. Some of it's anti-Semitic, he doesn't deny. Some of it is a certain progressive, intersectional, surprisingly illiberal discourse. Some of it is moral critics of Israel who've now swung to an extreme of undermining Israel's existence. And some of this is simply the cause of the day. Combined, this means that, to use his terms, the marketplace gets lost and we lose any intentionality, because we lose the ability to engage intellectually with important conversation. And this is what becomes so dangerous, and this is the tinderbox waiting to erupt in flames if we don't think it has already. In other words, there is plenty of fuel on the fire, but no one is controlling it. There is no special place because it's everywhere. And there's no special prayer because those who are repeating the vitriol most often don't fully know what they're saying. In this moment of complete bewilderment, we can, of course, turn to our Torah. Our parasha this Shabbat, Acharei Mot, opens with another well-known story that both Sydney and Ben spoke about, the sacrifice of the scapegoat. Leviticus chapter 16 describes this rather bizarre ritual in which the high priest is commanded by God to take 2 goats and bring them to the entrance of the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. One of the goats is to be marked for Adonai, to be sacrificed as a sin offering. The other has the hands of the high priest laid upon it and has all of the iniquities of the Israelites confessed upon it, and is then released into the wilderness to Azazel by way of atonement. With regards to intentionality, this elaborate expiation ritual can potentially be read in 2 different ways. On one hand, we could interpret the scapegoat in its most literal sense. It could be seen as the ultimate symbol of evading responsibility, being taken as an opportunity to cast away our wrongdoings by putting all the blame on someone or something else. How wonderful might this be for us, for it would mean that we don't have to think more or do more or learn more to be better in the future. Yet, Rabbi Plaut of blessed memory in his Torah commentary teaches us that this scapegoat sent to Azazel has shifted its focus over history. Azazel, he writes, could have been an ancient demonic being, we've heard a little bit about this from our B'nai Mitzvah students, residing in the wilderness, whose abode was the locus of impurity. Later, the Greeks would translate Azazel as dismissal or the goat that departs, and so could also have been the name of a place. Plaut continues to teach that our Apocrypha, our later biblical canon, will refer to Azazel as an angelic leader who was lured into rebellion against God. The Talmud will appear to infrequently interchange Azazel with Satan, a hostile power who must be overcome or appeased, or who occasionally serves as a prosecutor that challenges God. The modern usage of the term, Plaut will then summarize, was coined by biblical translator William Tyndale as an entity towards whom the guilt of a community was formally transferred and then removed. Today, we've taken this term as individuals, with the scapegoat being someone or something that we ourselves blame for our own misfortunes or faults, without the communal aspect. If we boil it down then, through this evolution, we can discern that Azazel has been mostly removed from its original context, lacking the same intention that our predecessors understood. And my, oh my, can we see this fundamental lack of understanding and subsequent twist of intention playing out across campuses the world over. It may not be too much of an exaggeration to say that they too have lost their way in the wilderness. Alternatively, and far more positively, we like to remain positive, this vignette could be read as one of deep intentionality. Its many details and specifics could indicate that it has been given all of its due consideration. With each of its deliberate steps and instructions, we are perhaps faced with no choice but to focus on this casting away of our sins and our efforts to improve our ways. And furthermore, we traditionally recite this section of our Torah at what is the most intentional, perhaps, time of year, Yom Kippur, as we heard about from Ben and from Sydney. So on the animal theme, the Mishnah teaches us that during these sacred days, each of us passes before God, kivnei maron, like sheep. For God is the one who, in the words of the psalmist, mevin et kol ma'asehem, considers all our deeds. Put differently, it's precisely through acting with thoughtfulness that we reflect a bit of the divine spark in the world and that we are noticed by God in turn. At this period in the Jewish calendar, we find ourselves in another time of the counting down of the 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, known as the Omer. Every evening, we count over to the next day, reciting, Hineni muchan umezuman, here I am, ready and willing to fulfill this mitzvah. The Kabbalists will later teach us that each of the 49 days of the Omer are associated with a different divine attribute, and we're implored to reflect upon them and emulate these qualities in our own lives. Each of the weeks has an overarching theme, and each day a specific virtue. So for example, today is the 11th day of the Omer, known as, and the theme of the week is Gevurah, or might, and today's virtue is Netzach, or endurance, making it Netzach shebigvurah, endurance within might. So in other words, it becomes not so much the accounting of time, but the accounting of what we do with that time, the intention of how we use it, that becomes the real mitzvah. So as we conclude, we look to the coming days and weeks, and we can ask, how can we act with intention, act with a little bit of Netzach shebigvurah at this moment? The first of 2 suggestions you might have seen from the UJA in the hours before Shabbat yesterday, and it was an urgent call to email the presidents of our Canadian universities to encourage them to enforce campus rules, keep extremist entities away, and hold those who spread hate accountable, and to protect Jewish students. The second of 2 suggestions is to attend tomorrow the Stand With Students rally, Sunday, May 5 at 1 p.m., the location being sent directly to registrants only. Co-sponsored by the Canadian Women Against Anti-Semitism, Hillel Ontario, Allied Voices for Israel, and Stand With Us, the demonstration of solidarity aims to strengthen our students and let them know that they are not alone, are not being cast to Azazel in this fight against hatred. In our own quest for a more intentional society, may we learn to find our way back to the special place where we can light a special fire and say a special prayer once more. Let us not count time, but make our time count as we stand together and say, Hineni muchan umezuman, here we are, ready and willing to stand for a better world. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.